What happens when a person's worst nightmare unfolds at 37,000 feet for 17-year-old Jordan Carter? It wasn't just the shaking of the plane, it was the chilling silence of dismissal. Trapped in her seat, a crippling panic attack took hold, triggered by a sound that screamed of impending disaster. But to the flight attendant and the passengers around her, she was just a hysterical black teenager making a scene. They rolled their eyes, sighed in annoyance, and told her to calm down. They ignored her pleas. They ignored her warnings. But they couldn't ignore her when she finally stood up, walked past them all, and knocked on the cockpit door, holding her pilot's license. The recycled air of the cabin was a familiar perfume to Jordan Carter. It was a sterile mix of jet fuel cleaning solution and the faint, lingering scent of thousands of journeys. For her, it was the smell of home, the scent of ambition. At just 17, she had more logged flight hours than most people have on a road trip. Seated in 14B, an aisle seat on Trans-American Airways Flight 828 from Denver to New York, she felt the familiar, gentle thrum of the Airbus A321's engines through the soles of her sneakers. It was a lullaby. Jordan was small for her age, with bright, intelligent eyes that seemed to absorb everything. She was dressed in comfortable jeans and a hoodie from the Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, a gift from her father for acing her private pilot license (PPL) exam 6 months prior. Tucked in her backpack was the reason for this flight, an invitation to the prestigious Next Gen Aviators Conference in New York, a summit for the brightest young minds in aerospace. She was a prodigy, the kind of teenager who read FAA regulations for fun and found beauty in the complex dance of hydraulics and avionics. The flight began like any other. The safety demonstration, the final cabin, check the powerful stomach-dropping surge of takeoff. Jordan watched the patchwork of Denver's suburbs shrink below a familiar thrill bubbling in her chest. Flying wasn't just a passion, it was in her blood. Her father, a retired Air Force colonel, had first put her hands on the yoke of a Cessna 172 when she was 13. He taught her to feel the plane, to listen to its language, to respect the unforgiving physics of the sky. But he had also been with her during the incident. 2 years ago, a small twin-engine plane, a training flight with her dad and an instructor. A sudden violent storm over the Rockies. An engine sputtered, choked, and died its failure marked by a terrifying high-pitched metallic whine that sliced through the roar of the wind and rain. They had dropped thousands of feet in seconds before her father, with sheer grit and skill, had managed to land them safely in a remote field. No one was seriously injured, but the sound, that shriek of dying metal, had etched itself into the deepest parts of her mind. It was a scar on her otherwise pristine love for the sky. She'd gone through therapy, countless hours of simulator training, and had pushed through it to get her license. She was fine. Mostly. The woman in the window seat, 14A, introduced herself with a clipped, dismissive tone. "Brenda Wexler," she said, barely making eye contact, before burying her nose in a glossy magazine. She was in her late 50s, immaculately dressed in a cream-colored pantsuit, her face a mask of bored entitlement. Across the aisle in 14C was a man in a crisp suit, Mr. Peterson, who had immediately opened his laptop. His shoulders hunched with an air of self-importance. He huffed audibly when the flight attendant asked him to put it away for takeoff. The primary flight attendant in their section was a woman named Susan. She had a practiced plastic smile and a demeanor that suggested she had seen every kind of passenger and was impressed by none of them. When she took Jordan's drink order, her eyes flickered over the aviation logo on Jordan's hoodie with a faint, almost imperceptible smirk, as if finding the enthusiasm of a young girl quaint and slightly pathetic. For the first hour, the flight was smooth. The drink service came and went. Brenda ordered a Chardonnay, and complained that it wasn't cold enough. Mr. Peterson grumbled about the Wi-Fi speed. Jordan kept to herself a textbook on advanced aerodynamics open on her lap, the complex equations a comforting distraction. She was charting their course in her head, mentally running through the pre-flight checklists, a habit she couldn't shake. She noted the slight adjustments in engine pitch, the gentle corrections of the autopilot. Everything was nominal. Everything was perfect. Until it wasn't. It started subtly, a change in the engine's hum, a vibration low and deep that felt different from standard turbulence. It was a rhythmic, dissonant pulse that ran up Jordan's spine. Most passengers wouldn't have noticed. Brenda didn't look up from her magazine. Mr. Peterson's typing didn't slow. But Jordan's entire body went rigid. Her ears, trained by hundreds of hours of listening to the symphony of an aircraft, focused on the sound coming from the left side of the plane. The port engine. She closed her eyes, trying to isolate it. It was a faint, grinding noise, almost imperceptible under the roar. Her heart began to beat a little faster. It's nothing, she told herself, just a harmonic imbalance. The system will correct it. But it didn't correct. The vibration grew stronger, and then piercing through the cabin's white noise came the sound. A high-pitched metallic whine. It was fainter than the one from 2 years ago, but it was the same note, the same terrifying key. The sound of metal under stress, the sound of failure. The carefully constructed walls around her trauma began to crumble. The cabin air suddenly felt thick and suffocating. The calm, familiar hum of the engines was gone, replaced by a prelude to disaster. Her carefully controlled world, once as wide as the sky, was now shrinking to the confines of seat 14B, and she was falling. The whine sharpened a needle of sound, drilling directly into Jordan's memory. Suddenly, she wasn't in an Airbus at 37,000 feet. She was back in that tiny cockpit rain, lashing against the plexiglass, the world outside a grey, swirling vortex. She could feel the sickening lurch of the aircraft dropping, see the terror in the instructor's eyes, hear her father's voice, tight and controlled, shouting commands. Her own breath caught in her chest. A cold sweat beaded on her forehead, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the armrests. The pages of her aerodynamics textbook blurred. The equations that had been a comfort just moments before now seemed like a foreign language. Her meticulously organized mind, her greatest asset, was dissolving into chaos. Breathe, Jordan. Just breathe. Analyze. Don't panic. She tried to force her training to the forefront. What could it be? A compressor blade issue. An oil pressure drop. The vibration was rhythmic, a consistent thumping that she could now feel through the floor. It was a symptom of a significant imbalance in the engine's rotating assembly. This wasn't turbulence. This was mechanical. Brenda Wexler finally noticed her. She glanced over her lip, curling in distaste. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked, her tone laced with annoyance rather than concern. "You're shaking the entire row." Jordan couldn't form words. Her throat was tight, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She shook her head, her eyes wide, with a fear that was primal and all-consuming. "Well, for heaven's sake, if you're afraid of flying, perhaps you should have taken a bus." Brenda sniffed, turning back to her magazine with a dismissive flick of the page. The casual cruelty of the comment barely registered. Jordan's world had narrowed to the sound, the vibration, and the suffocating certainty that something was terribly wrong. She fumbled for the call button above her head, her finger trembling as she pressed it. The small light illuminated a silent scream for help in the indifferent cabin. Her breathing was becoming ragged short, shallow gasps. She knew the signs. Hypoxia. Not from a lack of cabin pressure, but from the oxygen starvation of a full-blown panic attack. The edges of her vision began to tunnel. Mr. Peterson across the aisle let out an exaggerated sigh, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. He shot a venomous glare first at Jordan, then at the illuminated call light. "Unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head and typing faster, as if to protest the interruption through his keyboard. It felt like an eternity before the flight attendant Susan arrived. She stood over Jordan, her smile fixed and strained. "Is there a problem here?" Jordan looked up, her face pale. "The engine," she managed to choke out, pointing toward the window. "The port engine. There's a vibration and a sound, a whine." Susan's professional smile didn't waver, but her eyes glazed over with a familiar brand of practiced patience reserved for nervous flyers. "Ma'am, turbulence is perfectly normal. We're just passing through a bit of rough air. The captain has everything under control." "No, it's not turbulence," Jordan insisted, her voice trembling but urgent. "It's a rhythmic vibration, consistent, and the pitch of the engine has changed. You have to listen." Susan leaned in slightly, a theatrical gesture of listening before straightening up. "I don't hear anything out of the ordinary. Everything is fine. Can I get you a glass of water? Perhaps some ginger ale?" It was the standard playbook for calming a hysterical passenger. In her eyes, Jordan wasn't a source of information. She was a problem to be managed. "I don't need water," Jordan pleaded, her voice rising in pitch. "I need you to tell the pilot to check the N1 fan speed readings for the #1 engine. There might be a fan blade imbalance, or worse, a compressor stall." The technical jargon stopped Susan for a second. Her smile faltered. She looked at the teenager, this young black girl in a hoodie, and a flicker of something new crossed her face, suspicion. The smirk from earlier returned, but now it was condescending. "That's very specific," she said slowly. "Have you been watching a few too many disaster movies?" The laughter was quiet, but it was there. Brenda let out a derisive snort. Mr. Peterson smirked without looking up from his screen. Jordan felt a hot flush of shame and anger cut through her fear. They weren't just dismissing her, they were mocking her. They saw her race, her age, her gender, and put her in a box labeled hysterical girl. They didn't see the pilot. They didn't see the hours of training. They saw a stereotype. "I know what I'm talking about," Jordan said, her voice shaking with a mixture of terror and fury. "I'm sure you think you do," Susan said, her voice now taking on a patronizing, soothing tone, as if speaking to a toddler throwing a tantrum. "Now I'm going to get you that water. Just take a few deep breaths. In through your nose, out through your mouth. You'll feel much better." She turned and walked away, her mission of pacification complete in her mind. Jordan was left alone, her panic now compounded by a suffocating sense of helplessness. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was a Cassandra, cursed to see the future, but never to be believed. The vibration in the floor intensified, a death rattle no one else seemed to hear. And the sound, the terrible sound of falling, was getting louder. The glass of water arrived, delivered with the same sterile, dismissive smile. A plastic cup filled with ice, and a thin, chemical-tasting liquid that felt like an insult. Jordan stared at the condensation trickling down the side. It was a pat on the head, a there, a complete and utter invalidation of everything she was. "Drink up," Susan chirped, already turning her attention to another passenger's request. "It'll help." Jordan pushed the cup away. The water wouldn't fix an imminent engine failure, her mind now a battlefield between paralyzing fear and analytical training latched onto the latter as a desperate survival mechanism. The panic was a storm, but her knowledge was a lighthouse. She had to focus. "Okay, Carter. Think. What are the symptoms? 1. Rhythmic vibration, increasing in intensity. Not the random shudder of turbulence, but a steady, pulsing thrum, consistent with a rotating machinery imbalance. 2. High-pitched whine, the classic signature of metal-on-metal friction or extreme aerodynamic stress within the engine. 3. Change in engine pitch. She could hear it. The deep bass roar of the CFM56 engine had developed a discordant, sickly overtone. Her brain cycled through possibilities. Could it be a simple sensor malfunction? Possible, but that wouldn't explain the physical vibration she was feeling through the aircraft's frame. Could it be ice buildup on the fan blades? Unlikely at this cruising altitude and temperature. The most logical and most terrifying conclusion was a progressive mechanical failure. A fan blade could have developed a fracture. At thousands of RPM, even a small imbalance could tear an engine apart. "Would you please stop jiggling your leg?" Brenda snapped from the window seat. "You're making me nauseous." Jordan looked down and realized her leg was bouncing uncontrollably, a physical manifestation of her spiraling anxiety. She forced it, still planting both feet firmly on the floor. The vibration was still there, a constant, malevolent hum. "I'm sorry," Jordan said, her voice barely a whisper. "But something is wrong with this plane." Brenda rolled her eyes so dramatically it was a performance. "Oh, for the love of God! The flight attendant told you it was fine. The pilots know how to fly their little airplane. You're just having a panic attack. It's not our problem." "It will be everyone's problem if the engine fails." Jordan shot back, her voice louder and sharper than she intended. Heads turned. A few rows ahead, a man looked back with an annoyed expression. A mother holding a baby gave her a worried glance. Mr. Peterson across the aisle finally slammed his laptop shut with a loud crack. "That's it!" He boomed, his face red with fury. "I am trying to close a multi-million-dollar deal here, and I can't even think with this commotion, flight attendant." Susan was there in an instant, her face now a mask of stern authority. "Is there an issue, sir?" "Yes, there's an issue." Mr. Peterson gestured angrily at Jordan. "This girl is disrupting the entire cabin. She's yelling about the plane crashing. If she can't handle herself, she needs to be sedated or restrained. Some of us have important work to do." The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Restrained. The word hit Jordan like a physical blow. They were painting her as unhinged, dangerous. Susan turned to Jordan, her eyes cold. The pretense of empathy was gone. "Ma'am, I am not going to warn you again. You are creating a disturbance. You are making other passengers uncomfortable and causing a safety issue. I need you to remain quiet for the rest of this flight. Am I understood?" It was a conspiracy of silence, an unspoken agreement among the adults in charge to label her the problem. Her valid experience-based fears were being twisted into adolescent hysterics. They had created a narrative she was the crazy girl, and they were the sane, rational passengers suffering her meltdown. Desperation clawed at her. "I have a pilot's license." She said the words, tumbling out. "I've studied this. I've trained in simulators. I'm telling you that sound is not normal." This was her last card, her appeal to a shared understanding of the sky. It was a mistake. Brenda Wexler let out a short, barking laugh. "Oh, that's rich. A pilot's license. At your age, did you get it out of a cereal box?" Even Susan's stern facade cracked into a smirk. "A pilot's license. That's nice, dear. My nephew has a very realistic video game, too. Now that's the last I want to hear of it." The dismissal was absolute. They had not only ignored her warning, they had mocked her greatest accomplishment, the very core of her identity. The last embers of her hope of being heard died out. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. She shrank back into her seat, wrapping her arms around herself. The vibration seemed to mock her, growing stronger with each passing minute. The whine was a constant siren song of disaster in her ears. She looked out the window past Brenda's annoyed silhouette at the brilliant, sunlit wing. It looked so serene, so powerful, slicing effortlessly through the thin air. But Jordan knew the truth. Inside the sleek nacelle of the #1 engine, a monster was waking up, and she was the only one who could hear it roar. The next 20 minutes were a special kind of hell. Jordan sat in a state of hyper-vigilant terror, trapped in a bubble of silence imposed by the hostile passengers and crew around her. She tried to regulate her breathing to push down the panic, but her body was a taut wire of anxiety. Every slight dip of the plane, every normal creak of the fuselage sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through her veins. She watched Susan walk up and down the aisle, smiling at other passengers, refilling coffee cups, her demeanor a perfect picture of normalcy. It was surreal. It was like watching someone tidy their living room while a fire raged in the kitchen. Did she not feel the vibration? Did she not hear the increasingly audible whine, or had she simply chosen not to? The vibration was no longer subtle. It was a tangible shudder that made the plastic tray table in front of her rattle softly. A passenger, a few rows back, a young man wearing headphones, took them off and looked around with a puzzled expression. He caught Jordan's eye, and she gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He frowned, a flicker of shared concern in his eyes, but then seemed to dismiss it, putting his headphones back on. Then the lights flickered. A brief, split-second dip in the cabin's illumination. Once. Twice. That got everyone's attention. A low murmur rippled through the cabin. Brenda Wexler looked up from her magazine, her mask of bored superiority finally cracking. Mr. Peterson stopped typing, his eyes darting toward the ceiling. The illusion of a perfectly normal flight was shattered. A moment later, the captain's voice crackled over the PA system. It was a calm, practiced baritone, the kind of voice designed to inspire confidence. "Folks, this is your captain speaking. We seem to be experiencing some minor instrument fluctuations up here in the cockpit. We're just going to turn off the seatbelt sign for a moment while we run a quick diagnostic. We'll have it sorted out shortly. In the meantime, sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." The voice was calm, but the words were not. Pilots don't talk about instrument fluctuations unless they have to, and they certainly don't turn off the seatbelt sign to run a diagnostic. That part was clearly a misstatement in an attempt to sound routine, which made it even more alarming. He had meant to say they were turning it on. A second later, the fasten seatbelt sign pinged on, confirming his slip-up. Jordan's blood ran cold. Instrument fluctuations. It was happening. The engine vibration was likely interfering with the electrical generators. The flickering lights were a symptom of an unstable power supply from the port engine. If that generator failed, they would lose power to a significant portion of the aircraft's systems. The other passengers were scared now. The mood in the cabin had shifted from annoyance at Jordan to a generalized, palpable fear. Brenda was gripping her armrest, her knuckles white. Mr. Peterson was staring intently out the window, his bravado gone. "What was that? What's happening?" Brenda asked, her voice a nervous squeak. She was looking at Jordan, her earlier derision replaced by a sliver of desperate hope that the hysterical girl might have an answer. Jordan just shook her head, her face grim. "I told you." Susan and the other flight attendants began to move through the cabin, their smiles now tight and forced their movements a little too quick. They checked seatbelts and secured loose items, their voices chipper, but their eyes betraying a deep-seated worry. Susan passed their row, and Jordan met her gaze. The flight attendant's eyes were wide, and for the first time, Jordan saw not condescension, but fear. Real, unadulterated fear. Yet even now there was no apology, no acknowledgement. To admit Jordan was right would be to admit she had failed, that she had ignored a credible warning. Suddenly the plane lurched violently to the left. It wasn't a drop, but a sharp, sickening yaw, as if the aircraft was being pushed sideways by an invisible hand. A few screams erupted from the back of the cabin. The rattling of the tray tables became a loud clatter. Jordan knew instantly what it was. Asymmetric thrust. The port engine was losing power. To compensate and keep the plane flying straight, the autopilot was applying heavy rudder, causing the yaw. The pilots were fighting the plane. The calm voice of the captain came on again, but this time it was strained, the professional calm fraying at the edges. Folks were going to be diverting to Pittsburgh International Airport. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts securely fastened. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing. Diverting. Prepare for landing. The words were code. This was an emergency. Pittsburgh was the closest major airport. They weren't going to make it to New York. The plane banked steeply, the G-force pressing Jordan into her seat. Outside, the sunlit wing dipped, pointing toward the vast green and brown quilt of the American heartland below. They were descending and fast. The panic in the cabin escalated into quiet, controlled chaos. People were praying, others were making hushed phone calls trying to send a final message. And in the middle of it all sat Jordan, her own fear, a cold, hard knot in her stomach. But something else was rising alongside it, a strange, terrifying clarity. The panic had burned away, leaving behind the pure, unyielding steel of her training. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was a pilot, and her plane was in trouble. She knew the systems of an A321. She knew the emergency procedures. She also knew that instrument failures combined with a potential engine fire, a real possibility with a compressor stall, could create a cascade of alarms in the cockpit, overwhelming the pilots with information. A condition known as cognitive tunneling could set in where they focus on one problem while missing another more critical one. She looked at Susan now strapping herself into a jump seat, her face ashen. She looked at Brenda, her eyes squeezed shut in prayer. She looked at Mr. Peterson, staring blankly ahead, his multi-million-dollar deal forgotten. They were all passengers. They were helpless. But she wasn't. In that moment, a decision formed in her mind. It was insane. It was against every rule. It could get her arrested, her career in aviation destroyed before it even began. But it was the only thing she could think of to do. She couldn't sit here and wait to die, not when she might hold a piece of the puzzle that could save them all. She unbuckled her seatbelt. The small click was deafening in the tense silence. The click of the metal latch releasing echoed in the small space around seat 410B. It was a sound of finality, of a line being crossed. Brenda's eyes snapped open wide with disbelief and fresh terror. "What in God's name are you doing? He said to stay seated." Jordan didn't answer. She stood up her legs, surprisingly steady in the vibrating cabin. The plane was still in a controlled but rapid descent. Standing was difficult, requiring her to brace against the seat in front of her. Every instinct, every rule she had ever learned screamed at her to sit down, strap in, and trust the crew. But a deeper instinct, the one her father had instilled in her, the pilot's instinct, was screaming louder. Her objective was clear and terrifying: the cockpit. She knew the protocol. The cockpit door was reinforced, locked, and bulletproof. It couldn't be opened from the outside during flight. Her only hope was to convince the flight attendant to use the intercom to relay a message so specific and so accurate that the pilots would have no choice but to listen. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and turned to face the aisle. Her movement drew immediate attention. Gasps rippled through the nearby rows. To the other passengers gripped by the fear of an emergency landing, her actions were pure insanity. She was a rogue element in a situation that demanded absolute compliance. Susan, strapped into her jump seat near the galley, saw her, and her eyes widened in a mixture of fury and panic. "Ma'am, get back in your seat now," she yelled, her voice straining to be heard over the groaning of the airframe. Jordan ignored her. She started moving forward, her steps careful and deliberate, one hand on the seat backs for balance. The plane lurched again, and she stumbled, catching herself on an armrest. "Somebody stop her!" a man shouted from a few rows back. Mr. Peterson, who had been frozen in fear, was suddenly galvanized into action. He saw not a potential savior, but the hysterical girl from before, now completely unhinged and endangering them all. He unbuckled his own seatbelt. "I'll handle this," he grunted, stepping into the aisle to block her path. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and imposing. He stood in front of her, his face a mask of righteous anger. "Sit down," he commanded, his voice low and threatening. Jordan looked up at him, her heart pounding. This was the moment, the point of no return. She could retreat to her seat, branded a lunatic, and wait for their fate, or she could push through. "Get out of my way," she said, her voice quiet, but ringing with an authority that surprised even herself. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, laser-like focus. "I'm not going to let some crazy kid run wild on this plane," Peterson snarled, reaching a hand out to grab her arm. "Don't touch me," Jordan said, her eyes flashing. "You don't understand what's happening. The pilots are dealing with a cascade failure. The vibrations from the engine are likely causing erroneous readings on multiple systems. They might be chasing a ghost of false alarm while the real problem gets worse." Her words were precise, technical, and delivered with absolute certainty. For a split second, Peterson faltered. This wasn't the rambling of a panicked teenager. It was the language of a professional. But the moment of doubt passed, replaced by his own fear and prejudice. "You don't know anything," he spat. "You're just scared." From the front of the cabin, Susan was on her feet, rushing toward them. "Sir, get back to your seat, both of you." The scene was devolving into chaos. Jordan knew she had only seconds. She couldn't fight her way past Peterson. She had to use her mind. Flight 828 is an Airbus A321-200, equipped with 2 CFM-65B engines. She said, her voice rising to cut through the noise. She was speaking not just to Peterson, but to Susan, to anyone who might listen. The rhythmic vibration, combined with the power fluctuations and the yaw, indicates a progressive failure of the N1 fan assembly in the number 1 engine. This isn't just a loss of thrust, it's a potential uncontained engine failure. If a blade separates, it could rupture the fuel lines in the wing or sever hydraulic controls. We don't have minutes. We have seconds. Every word was a hammer blow of truth. The technical detail, the calm recitation of catastrophic possibilities, was more chilling than any scream. Susan stopped dead in her tracks. Her face went pale. As a flight attendant, she had been trained on the basics of emergencies. She didn't know what N1 fan assembly meant, but she knew what uncontained engine failure meant. It was the stuff of nightmares, the worst-case scenario. Peterson was still standing in her way, but his aggressive posture had slackened. The certainty in his face had been replaced by a dawning horror. Jordan pressed her advantage. "I need you to get on the intercom and tell the captain exactly what I just said. Tell him a passenger has identified the symptoms of an imminent uncontained failure in Engine 1. Tell him to check the EGT, the exhaust gas temperature. It's probably redlining." Susan was staring at her, her mouth slightly agape. The girl she had dismissed as a nervous flyer, the teenager she had patronized with a glass of water, was now speaking with the vocabulary of a test pilot. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. "Who was this girl? "I can't," Susan stammered. "We can't interfere with the flight crew during an emergency." "They are already in an emergency." Jordan's voice cracked with the sheer frustration of it all. "They might be looking at a dozen different warning lights right now. They need focused information from someone who can feel what the plane is doing back here. You have to trust me." It was a stalemate. Peterson blocked her path. Susan was frozen by protocol. The plane continued its terrifying descent. Jordan knew that just talking wasn't enough. She needed to give them something undeniable, something that would shatter their perception of her and force them to act. Her hand dove into the back pocket of her jeans. She pulled out her wallet, a simple, worn leather wallet. Her fingers, shaking, slightly fumbled inside. She bypassed her driver's license, her student ID. She pulled out a small, laminated card. It was her FAA private pilot license. Jordan held the small plastic card aloft her hand, trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer, earth-shaking gravity of the moment. The cabin light, still flickering intermittently, caught the holographic eagle of the Federal Aviation Administration seal. In the tense, claustrophobic atmosphere of the aisle, it seemed to glow. "My name is Jordan Carter," she announced, her voice cutting through the hushed panic of the cabin. She pitched her voice to be heard by Susan, who was still standing a few feet away. "This is my FAA private pilot license. Certificate number 7821 9B4C. I have 150 logged flight hours, 40 of them on multi-engine aircraft simulators. I am telling you as a certified pilot, this aircraft is in imminent danger of catastrophic failure." Silence. The words, the license, the sheer unadulterated confidence in her voice landed like a shockwave. Mr. Peterson, who had been about to physically shove her back toward her seat, froze. His eyes locked onto the card in her hand, then darted to her face. The angry, dismissive expression on his face dissolved, replaced by a slack-jawed cocktail of confusion and awe. Brenda Wexler, craning her neck to see from her seat, let out a choked gasp. The teenager she had mocked, the girl with the cereal box license, was holding the real thing, but it was Susan's reaction that mattered most. The flight attendant's face, already pale with fear, drained of all remaining color. The rulebook, her training, her ingrained prejudice, all of it was being shredded before her eyes. The situation had gone catastrophically off script. The hysterical passenger was not a passenger. She was a pilot. The warnings she had dismissed were not the ramblings of a nervous flyer. They were the professional assessment of a fellow aviator. The weight of her misjudgment, of her condescension, came crashing down on her. She hadn't just been rude, she had potentially ignored a critical safety warning. "Call them," Jordan urged, her gaze locked on Susan's. "Now, tell them what I said. Tell them to cut the fuel to Engine 1 entirely. Don't just idle it, shut it down. Whatever is broken in there is tearing the engine apart. They need to stop it before it breaks free." Susan's training and Jordan's desperate logic were at war in her mind. Protocol was screaming no. Survival was screaming yes. With a trembling hand, she reached over and picked up the intercom handset from the wall of the galley. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons. "Captain Miller," she said, her voice barely a whisper, cracking with emotion. "This is Susan in the main cabin." A tense pause. The captain's voice, clipped and strained, came back over the speaker, audible to those nearby. "Not now, Susan. We're busy." "Sir, you don't understand." Susan stammered, her eyes darting to Jordan. "There's a passenger here. She's a pilot. She says we have an imminent, uncontained failure in Engine 1. She says to shut it down. Completely. Cut the fuel." There was a moment of charged silence from the cockpit. The idea of a passenger, even one claiming to be a pilot, giving instructions during an emergency, was unheard of. "That's absurd," another voice, younger and sharper, crackled over the speaker. The first officer, David Chen. We have a cascade of sensor errors, but the core engine readings are... Suddenly, a new sound filled the cabin, a loud, violent bang, followed by a horrific, grinding screech of tortured metal. The entire plane shuddered violently, throwing Jordan against Peterson, who instinctively grabbed her to keep them both from falling. The lights went out completely for 2 terrifying seconds before the emergency battery-powered lights flickered on, casting the cabin in an eerie, dim glow. Screams erupted throughout the plane. The grinding noise from outside was deafening. "Mayday! Mayday! Mayday!" The captain's voice boomed over the PA, no longer calm, but filled with the raw adrenaline of a man staring into the abyss. Transamerican 828. We have a fire and failure of engine number 1. I repeat, engine fire and catastrophic failure. We are declaring an emergency. The confirmation of her worst fears sent a fresh spike of terror through Jordan, but her resolve hardened. They were out of time. "He sees the fire now," Jordan yelled at Susan over the din. "The failure is happening. Tell him the fire suppression system might not be enough if the engine is still rotating. They have to cut the fuel and pull the fire handle now." Susan, tears streaming down her face, relayed the message, her voice choked with panic. "Captain," she says, "cut the fuel. Pull the fire handle." There was no response, only the sickening sound of the dying engine and the continued violent shuddering of the airframe. The pilots were likely wrestling with the controls, fighting the massive drag from the failed engine and the asymmetric thrust. Jordan knew she couldn't wait. She pushed past the stunned Mr. Peterson, who offered no resistance, and lunged for the intercom handset, herself ripping it from Susan's hand. She pressed the button. "Captain Miller, First Officer Chen. This is Pilot Jordan Carter. I am in the main cabin. Your engine is tearing itself from the pylon. I can see the metal peeling back. Shut it down, or you will lose all hydraulic control on the left wing when it separates." Her words were clear, concise, and utterly devoid of panic. It was a pilot-to-pilot communication. She wasn't a passenger anymore. She was part of the crew. There was a beat of silence. Then the captain's voice, grim and decisive. "Susan, get her up here." The cabin fell silent again. The only sounds, the wail of the alarms and the roar of the single good engine. "Get her up here." It was a command that broke dozens of federal regulations. But in that moment, the rules didn't matter. Only survival did. Susan stared at Jordan, then at the cockpit door. With a nod, she moved to the secure keypad next to the door. She punched in a code. A buzzer sounded. "Captain," she said into the intercom, "I'm bringing her in." The heavy lock on the cockpit door clicked open. Stepping through the cockpit door was like entering the heart of the storm. The small space was a cacophony of alarms, a shrill repeating chime, a synthesized voice barking, "Engine 1 fire," and the urgent staccato of a master warning light. The dim red-lit interior was a stark contrast to the bright daylight, visible through the windows. Directly ahead, the world was tilted at a precarious angle as the plane continued its descent. Captain Robert Miller, a man in his late 50s with graying temples and lines of immense stress etched around his eyes, was wrestling with the yoke. His knuckles were white. The first officer, David Chen Younger, and his face beaded with sweat, was rapidly flipping switches on the overhead panel, his hands a blur of motion. They both glanced back as Jordan entered their eyes wide. For a moment they saw what everyone else had seen, a terrified teenage girl. But then they saw the look on her face, the intense focus, the unnerving calm, and their expressions shifted. "You're Carter." Captain Miller grunted, his voice strained as he fought to keep the plane stable. The aircraft was trying to roll to the left, pulled by the dead weight and drag of the destroyed engine. "Yes, Captain." Jordan said, her eyes immediately scanning the instrument panel, the glass cockpit displays that were her native language. She saw it all in a flash. The number 1 engine gauges were a Christmas tree of red warnings. EGT was off the charts. N1 rotation speed was 0. Oil pressure was gone. And most critically, multiple hydraulic system warnings were lit up. "We've pulled the fire handle and discharged the first bottle. Fire warning is still active." Chen reported, his voice tight. "We're losing hydraulic pressure in the green and yellow systems." The engine separation must have severed the lines. Jordan said, her voice steady. She pointed to the primary flight display. "Sir, you're fighting the rudder trim. The autopilot is trying to compensate, but it's putting too much stress on the vertical stabilizer. Disconnect it and fly the plane by hand. You'll have a better feel for it." Miller's eyes widened slightly. The girl was right. In the chaos, he'd been fighting the automation. He clicked a red button on his yoke, and the plane shuddered as the autopilot disengaged. He immediately had to apply heavy pressure on the right rudder pedal to keep the nose straight. "She's flying like a pig," he muttered. "We need to discharge the second fire bottle," Chen said. "Wait," Jordan interjected. They both looked at her. "The fire warning is still on, but is there any secondary indication? Is the fuselage temperature rising? Any smoke in the cabin?" Susan, standing terrified by the doorway, shook her head. "No smoke." "Then it might be a false positive," Jordan reasoned, her mind working at lightning speed. The fire could have destroyed the sensors, leaving the warning light on, even if the fire is out. The second bottle is our last resort. If there's another fire on landing, we'll need it. Let's not waste it. Miller considered her words for a fraction of a second, then nodded grimly. "She's right. Hold the second bottle. Focus on flying. David, declare the Mayday again. Tell Pittsburgh we have an uncontained failure, and will need the runway cleared and emergency services standing by. Tell them we have compromised hydraulic controls." As Chen got on the radio, Jordan's eyes stayed glued to the instruments. She saw something else, a subtle detail that in their overloaded state the pilots might have missed. The airspeed was dropping too fast. In their effort to descend quickly, they were losing crucial momentum. With the massive drag from the dead engine, their stall speed would be higher than normal. "Captain, your airspeed," she said urgently. "You're getting close to stall margin. Increase thrust on engine 2. We need to trade altitude for speed, but not this much. Level her out a bit, and let's establish a stable single-engine glide path." Miller glanced at the airspeed indicator, and a flicker of alarm crossed his face. She was right again. He had been so focused on the descent and the rudder that he was letting their energy bleed away. He pushed the throttle forward on the good engine, and the roar from the right side of the plane intensified. The plane stabilized, the terrifying rate of descent lessening into something more controlled, more survivable. For the next 10 minutes, and surreal calm descended upon the cockpit. Jordan stood between the two pilots, not touching anything, but acting as a third set of eyes, a crucial processing unit for the flood of information. She called out airspeeds, cross-referenced checklists, and offered quiet suggestions. She wasn't a teenager anymore. She was a member of the crew, her young voice, a steady, competent presence in the midst of chaos. She had transformed their frantic reactive struggle into a controlled, proactive emergency management. First Officer Chen, initially skeptical, was now looking at her with undisguised admiration. Captain Miller, while still focused intently on flying the crippled plane, would give her short, appreciative nods. She had earned their respect in the crucible of 30,000 feet. As the patchwork of Pennsylvania fields grew larger, the airport came into view. The red and white lights of fire trucks and ambulances were already lined up along the runway, a terrifying and welcome sight. "This is it," Miller said, his jaw tight. landing on one engine with partial hydraulics. It's going to be rough. Crosswind from the right, Jordan noted, reading a display. You'll need to crab on approach, then kick in left rudder just before touchdown to straighten her out. It'll be a fight. Miller grunted in agreement. He knew the procedure, but hearing her confirm it so calmly was reassuring. The final approach was the most intense experience of Jordan's life. The plane felt sluggish, unresponsive. Every input from Captain Miller was a battle. Jordan called out the altitudes. 500, 400, 300. The ground rushed up to meet them. For a terrifying second, Jordan thought they were coming in too fast, but Miller was a master. At the last moment, he flared the plane, easing the yoke back. The landing gear touched down with a deafening screech of rubber and a violent jolt that shook the entire airframe. Miller fought the rudder, keeping the plane on the center line as it bucked and swerved. Sparks flew from the left side as the damaged engine nacelle scraped against the runway. The plane finally blessedly began to slow down. It came to a stop not on the runway, but skewed into the grassy verge, surrounded by a swarm of emergency vehicles. In the cockpit, there was a moment of profound, deafening silence, broken only by the dying whine of the single good engine and the continued insistent chime of a single minor alarm. Captain Miller slumped back in his seat, his hands dropping from the controls, shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. He turned and looked at Jordan, his face pale, but his eyes shining with a deep, profound respect. "Kid," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you just saved my plane." The moment the plane came to a halt, the cabin door was flung open by firefighters. The emergency slides inflated with a loud hiss, and the evacuation began. In the cockpit, the tension broke, replaced by a wave of bone-deep exhaustion and overwhelming relief. Captain Miller was already talking to the tower, confirming the safety of the crew and passengers. As Jordan stood by, adrenaline giving way to a profound tremor in her hands, she saw the full weight of what she had done. She hadn't just saved the plane, she had irrevocably altered the course of her own life and the lives of those who had dismissed her. When they finally deplaned onto the tarmac, not via the slide, but by a set of rolling stairs brought by the ground crew, they were met by a sea of official-looking people, FAA investigators, NTSB agents, and airline executives in dark suits. The story of what had happened, the engine failure, the emergency landing, and the mysterious pilot passenger in the cockpit had already spread like wildfire. Captain Miller, with First Officer Chen at his side, made a beeline for the lead NTSB investigator, a stern-looking man named Frank Henderson. Miller clapped a heavy hand on Jordan's shoulder, keeping her by his side. "Frank," Miller said, his voice still raspy. "This is Jordan Carter. If it wasn't for her, we'd be a smoking hole in the ground right now. Mark my words. She diagnosed the problem before we did, and she was instrumental in managing the emergency. I broke about 50 regulations bringing her into my cockpit, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat. She's a hero." Henderson looked from the seasoned captain to the 17-year-old girl in the aviation hoodie, his expression one of professional curiosity and surprise. He simply nodded, making a note on his clipboard. "We'll need a full statement from all of you." It was then that the Karma began its descent, as swift and certain as gravity itself. The passengers were being triaged and interviewed nearby. Jordan saw Brenda Wexler speaking animatedly to an airline official, likely lodging a complaint. Jordan watched as the official listened, then was approached by another agent who whispered something in his ear. The official's posture changed. He looked over at Jordan, standing next to the captain, then back at Brenda. His polite, sympathetic expression hardened into a cool, professional mask. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now devoid of warmth. We have multiple witness accounts, including from the flight crew, that you and other passengers actively harassed a passenger who was attempting to warn the crew of a safety issue. Is that correct?" Brenda's face went from indignant to ghostly white. No. She was hysterical. She was frightening everyone. She was a licensed pilot, correctly identifying a catastrophic engine failure. The official stated flatly. The public nature of the dressing down was brutal. Other passengers who had witnessed Brenda's earlier behavior were watching their expressions a mixture of shame and contempt. The story unraveled quickly. Brenda Wexler, it turned out, was a prominent donor and board member for a well-known national charity focused on empowering underprivileged youth. The hypocrisy was staggering. Within a week, after a local news station picked up the story of her behavior on Flight 828, she was asked to resign from the board in disgrace. Her social standing, built on a lie of public compassion, was shattered. Next came Mr. Peterson. He was attempting to downplay his role, telling an investigator that he was simply trying to maintain order. However, another passenger, the young man with the headphones who had exchanged a look with Jordan, came forward. He had recorded a short video on his phone of Peterson aggressively blocking the aisle and threatening Jordan. The video capturing his angry, dismissive tirade was handed over to the airline and the FAA. It also inevitably found its way online. Peterson was identified as a senior partner at a major venture capital firm in Chicago. The ensuing viral backlash saw the hashtag #VentureVulture trending for 2 days. The tech startup he was trying to close a deal with a company run by a young female CEO who valued empathy publicly pulled their offer, citing a fundamental misalignment of values. His multi-million-dollar deal evaporated into a cloud of public shame. For Susan, the flight attendant, the reckoning was more professional, but no less severe. Her official debriefing with the airline and the FAA was grueling. She had to admit, under direct questioning, that she had ignored Jordan's specific technical warnings and had chosen to treat the situation as a behavioral issue rather than a potential safety threat. She wasn't fired. Her union protected her, but she was suspended for 6 months without pay and ordered to undergo extensive retraining, including modules on passenger assessment and CRM crew resource management. The smirk she had given Jordan had cost her dearly, not just in salary, but in the trust and respect of her colleagues. It was a permanent stain on her record, but for Jordan, the world was opening up. The day after the incident, the CEO of Trans-American Airways, a man named Charles Morrison, called her and her family personally. He apologized profusely for the way she was treated by his crew and fellow passengers. Then he made her an offer. The airline would not only cover her full tuition at Embry-Riddle, but would also grant her a conditional fast-tracked position in their pathway to the PROS pilot program, guaranteeing her a job as a first officer upon completion of her training and required flight hours. Her story was on every major news network. The shy, brilliant girl who loved the sky became an overnight inspiration. She was interviewed by Lester Holt on NBC Nightly News, her calm, intelligent demeanor captivating the nation. She used the platform not to brag, but to talk about the importance of listening to people regardless of their age, race, or gender. Standing in front of a bank of cameras a week later, with her proud father by her side, and a new scholarship certificate in her hand, Jordan Carter reflected on the journey. The sky had tested her, had thrown its worst at her. People had doubted her, dismissed her, and tried to silence her, but she had held on to her truth, her knowledge, and her courage. She had walked through the storm and landed on the other side, not just a survivor, but a commander of her own destiny. The sky was not her limit. It was her home, and she had just proven to the entire world that she belonged there. In the end, Jordan Carter's story isn't just about a flight that almost ended in disaster. It's a powerful lesson in perception and prejudice. It's about the incredible strength that can be found in the quietest voices and the profound expertise that can hide in the most unexpected places. The passengers who ignored her didn't just dismiss a scared teenager. They silenced a pilot, and in doing so, they almost sealed their own fate. Their karma wasn't supernatural. It was the simple, real-world consequence of their own actions being exposed to the light. Jordan didn't ask for the spotlight, but she used it to remind us all to listen a little closer, to judge a little less, and to recognize the hero that might be sitting right next to us. If Jordan's incredible story of courage and vindication moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And for more true stories of karma, justice, and incredible human spirit, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Thank you for watching.